Welcome to the Astro Guy podcast. I'm your host, Wayne Zoll. In this episode, we're diving into a hot topic in the astronomy world, smart telescopes. Over the past few years, these affordable instruments have been making waves, changing how amateur astronomers and even seasoned observers explore the night sky. If you spent any time in astronomy circles, you've probably heard of the ZWO-C star, the Dwarf Lab scopes, the Celestron Origin, and others. These aren't your traditional scopes. Instead of manually aiming, focusing, and fine-tuning, these smart telescopes do a lot of the work for you. They find and track celestial objects, stack images in real time, and make deep sky astrophotography more accessible than ever. But are they worth the hype? And how do they compare with traditional setups? To help us break it all down, I've got not one, but two great guests joining me. First, we have Phil Harrington, an author, educated, and seasoned observer who's written extensively on astronomy gear and observing in books and an astronomy magazine since the 1980s. Phil brings a wealth of experience and insights into how these new techniques fit into the broader world of astronomy. And alongside him is Al Papsun, who's been passionate about astronomy since his childhood. Al studied at Wesleyan University and later mentored students through NASA and the NSF's Project Astro. His love for astrophotography has evolved from film-based techniques to using the latest smart telescopes from Unistar, Vaonos, and Celestron. In the episode, we'll discuss the pros and cons of smart telescopes, who they're best suited for, and whether they're just a passing trend or the future of amateur astronomy. It's going to be an insightful conversation. Unfortunately for me, I had an issue with my audio that I didn't discover until after we had wrapped up the interview, so I had to re-record all my parts. So if you see me wearing different clothes throughout the video, you'll know why. But before we dive in, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you're listening on audio, leaving a quick review or rating helps more people find the show. And if you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. If you want to support the show, you can buy us a cup of coffee. There's info in the show notes about it. It really helps the channel. All right, now let's get to the smart scopes. I want to welcome two amateur astronomers who are very well versed in smart telescopes. So let's start with the basics. What makes a telescope smart?
Stupid telescopes are, with lacking electronics, often older, so you're just looking visually through an eyepiece and looking into the greater universe. And then there's a succession of more automated telescopes. So if you have a clock drive that's following the stars, another level of automation. That's a little bit smarter than one without a clock drive. And then from there, you can add automation where you're assigning coordinates to an object and having the telescope slew automatically to that object. So that's another level. That telescope is a little bit smarter still. The current generation of really smart telescopes, though, are fairly self-contained and almost fully automatic in the sense that they will track the stars for an extended period of time or whatever object you're selecting and process a series of images one on top of another so that over time you get a much more detailed object as possible even through a very large telescope if you're looking visually.
Now, with a traditional telescope, you have the scope, the eyepiece, and a mount, and that's really all you need for visual observing. But for those of us who do astrophotography, there's other gear involved. There's a camera, a guide scope, a guide camera, filter wheels, electronic focusers, dew controllers, and more, which can make for a pricey setup. But it seems like smart scopes have everything built in most cases, for a fraction of the price. There are many to choose from, and I know both of you own several smart telescopes. So what sets apart the different makes and models?
Let me say, I'm lucky to, writing for Astronomy magazine as I do, to test these things out. And the first one I tested out about a year ago was the Dwarf 2, made by a company called Dwarf Lab. And I wasn't convinced it was going to be any good, because it's a little refractor. It had a 24 millimeter objective lens, so less than an inch in diameter. And I thought, well, this is not going to really do anything. I thought it was all smoke and mirrors, quite honestly. Well, I got it and turned it on, and I was just astonished by this thing. Now I've been into this for well, about as long as Al's been in, 1968 for me. And I thought I had seen it all, but clearly I hadn't with this, because this tiny 24 millimeter refractor is what it is, was able to record things from my light polluted backyard on Long Island, where I could see maybe fourth magnitude on a good night. Okay, was able to record galaxies down to 15th magnitude. This is astonishing. Best example I always give is I took a shot of M44, the beehive cluster, Praise be in Cancer. Well, if you take a look at detailed charts of that region, you'll see that there are several galaxies beyond those stars. And when I wrote my book called Cosmic Challenge, one of the challenges, which talked about things that are difficult to see through varying sizes of telescopes, but seeing these galaxies beyond the stars of the beehive cluster was, to me, one of the ultimate challenges for the really largest backyard telescopes. And so I took a picture with the Dwarf 2, not expecting to see anything at all, and son of a gun if it didn't record some of those galaxies. There's another example right near the Pleiades in Taurus. There's a little galaxy, also maybe, I say little, I should say faint, galaxy, UGC 2438, for those who care, is about 14th magnitude. It's right next to the stars of the Pleiades. It recorded that also. It's a 24 millimeter aperture. So I was just, you got me. I'm sold right there. And I've been lucky enough to also review the C Star S50. And also, you mentioned the Celestron Origin, which is just, that's in a league all its own, the Celestron Origin. Yeah, my review of the Celestron, which ran in the last August issue of Astronomy, I summed it up by saying, there are smart telescopes, but the Celestron Origin is a genius, because I couldn't get over this thing, how it can. The other telescopes like the C Star and the Dwarf, although their software has gotten much more sophisticated, okay, and that's a big change in the last 12 months. But the Celestron, you have to do very minimal post processing, whereas with the other ones, you have all these very complicated and in some cases very expensive software packages, PixInsight, Photoshop, the list goes on, to come up with these really dramatic results that the raw image out of the telescope doesn't really even hint at but you have to know what you're doing, right? The Celestron, except adjusting the brightness a little bit, that's all I ever have to do to get some amazing results with it.
Is that because it's a faster scope?
It's f2.2, a 6-inch f2.2. It's a RASA. Okay, so it's not a telescope as much as it is an astrograph. And to draw the distinction, right, telescope is something you could typically look through, whereas an astrograph, nothing to look through, because as Al said, although a couple of the earlier models or some current models by the brands do have these little electronic eyepieces, a little TV screen you essentially look at in real time. But you can't do that with the Celestron. But yeah, it's the f2.2 that allows me to take 20-minute exposures, picking up more detail than a conventional telescope running in maybe f5 or 10 or whatever will take 3 hours to record. And here I'm doing in 20 minutes to a half hour. So it's astonishing.
We've mentioned the Dwarf and the Origin, but the first one to really hit it was the Unistellar about 10 years ago. Al, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I started with the Unistellar 1, which was their first model, and that one did have an electronic eyepiece. And the initial, similar to Phil, I was astonished by some of the early work that I did with it. The thing that distinguishes that telescope is it is more of a Newtonian telescope with a mirror as opposed to lens-based telescopes so the other brands are. And one of the disadvantages of that, at least in the early models, is that you had to frequently do collimation, which on that particular scope is very difficult to do appropriately. And if it's not done exactly, the stars have weird shapes and they're triangular shaped and very unappealing. But I was just astonished that you could do the sort of thing that allowed. One problem with Unistellar is that the initial run of the scope was geared toward amateur astronomers who had a real interest in astrophotography. And their software allowed you to do things with the scope that worked with that idea. About a year and a half into offering the telescope, they modified their software to something called Deep Dark Sky. And that was to almost to dumb down the telescope to make it easier to acquire targets, easier to get dark backgrounds. But in the process, it disallowed getting a lot of fine detail you were previously able to do. And there was no way to roll back the software to where the telescope had been. So subsequent to that software rollout, I've been pretty unhappy with the telescope program, frankly. Although I still used it for, it was good for some of the comets that were in the last year or two. You gave really decent images of those sorts of things, but they're really a tool for astrophotography. That by implementing this feature, they kind of destroyed the more serious amateurs that were trying to get good astro images from it. And then they have since come out with a newer generation of scopes that eliminate the collimation problem, but the newest generation of software does not run on their original scope. So essentially they've already effectively outdated and made obsolete their original telescope. They had an earlier scope called the Stellina, which was more expensive, and owners of the Stellina are similarly unhappy because they've not continued to support it with software and patches.
A few years ago, ZWO released the C-Star S50, which has become a very popular smart scope. And in 2024, they released the C-Star S30, a smaller and even less expensive scope. And just last month, Sam Wen, the founder of ZWO, announced that the C-Star S70 will be coming out soon. We might even get a preview of it at NEAF in April. You both have C-Stars. How do they compare to the other smart scopes?
Yeah, I like it. I like the 50. I like it quite a bit. It's fun. Like I say, I have 3. Just recently, I completed reviewing the Dwarf 3, which is this little guy right over here, and you can open it up, and you can see the telescope. I don't know if you can see in the camera here. Probably not going to do the so-called telephoto side and the wide field side. And you can use either to take images. Well, the telephoto side is still a really wide field. I mean, you could fit in all the Pleiades and have plenty of room to stretch. You could fit in pretty much the length of the Andromeda Galaxy and still have room at the end. So it's a wide field. The C-Stars field is narrower than that, certainly, and the Celestron's is narrower still. So depending on what I want to take pictures of, if I'm going to shoot the North American Nebula, I'm going to take out the Dwarf because it's going to give me that, and I'll probably pick up the Pelican Nebula right next door also. But if I'm looking, like the other night, I'm trying to shoot some of these Hickson compact galaxy groups, and these are tough. These are tough nuts. I was looking for HCG 40, which is really close to the Owl Nebula. And Al posted a picture of the Owl Nebula he took with his brand new Celestron Origin, and you didn't quite catch the galaxy group. It was just because of the way the field rotated. It was just out of the frame, unfortunately. But we're talking 14th, 15th magnitude galaxies in that case. And again, the Celestron, I'm picking it up in my backyard. So things like that, I'll use the Celestron for. So people say, well, which is better, A, B, or C? And I'll simply say yes, because it depends on what you're trying to shoot. And I'm really very fortunate to have access to all 3 of these things. And sometimes I run them simultaneously. And, all kinds of great stuff.
So with advances in smart scopes, AI, and automation, how has that all impacted the hobby of amateur astronomy?
Good. You go first.
It's actually, to me, a very troubling concept, because what I try to do, the telescope I mostly use for this type of photography, I have a Vespera, and it produces two level quality images. One that's a simple JPEG, and one that's a more sophisticated TIFF. And the JPEG is sent directly to an iPhone, so you can use really basic software to do, minor modifications to boost the contrast or color intensity, that sort of thing. So I try not to get overly involved with playing with the image, and I like working when I can with the JPEG image, because I feel it's a much more user-friendly option. And my concern with AI is that it's a really slippery slope once you start getting into the sophisticated software to modify the images, because at some point you're introducing, I'm not sure if it's correct to say you're introducing artifact, but you're getting farther and farther away from whatever the original photographic intention of the image was. And from an artistic standpoint, that can be very, very desirable and produce incredible images. But as you go farther and farther down that slope, and I see it increasingly with some of the group images that I see on some of the groups, it starts sliding very clearly into what I would consider AI territory, where the image that the scope actually produced is very far removed from the final image that it's presented. And I'm not sure where that dividing line is, quite honestly.
I had a conversation with a fellow who works for Dwarf Lab, and because they introduced with this latest version of their app, rather, they introduced AI, denoising and so forth. So after you take the picture, you stop the picture, and it goes through a couple I think it's like 3-minute routine. I can't remember exactly, but it denoises everything and so forth. And we were emailing back and forth about that, and he said that just to understand, we're not introducing artificial data. Okay, it's your data. What we are doing is we are taking out, and they do a really good job of this, taking out the noise and double checking the focus and stuff like that. And I compared an image, let's say I took just for laughs, of Sirius as it was, and then after the denoising. And the biggest change I saw was the background sky, because before the denoising, you have all this pixelated schmulch, going on with the, the little pixels of the reds and the greens and this, and it's all this rubbish, right? And that was a problem with the Dwarf before this version came along. And now it just smooths everything away. All of a sudden, Sirius doesn't start taking on a different personality. It's mainly in the background that it moves, and it's a huge improvement. I couldn't get over it, and I cited that in my review, that this is just it's a game changer. They also have introduced, I haven't had a chance to check it yet, I'm too busy playing around with this Celestron to go back to the Dwarf for the moment, but I'm waiting for the summer stars to come up, then I could do the North America Nebula and this and that. But they've also introduced something called what do they call it? Stellar Studio. It's something like that. I can't think of it exactly, the app. But all of a sudden, you don't really need Pix Insight, and you don't really need the other things, Photoshop and this and that. This allows you to do all of this just in app. And people have been raving about it. What I've seen on Facebook forums and so forth, and cloudy nights, people have been raving about it. So I'm actually anxious to try it, because that's one way the Dwarf was lagging behind the C-Star and the Celestron, was the background sky. Well, between this denoising plus this new studio portion of the app, sounds like that's another notch up in their sophistication, which I think is wonderful.
So do you think that smart scopes are a good purchase for those just starting out in the hobby?
I do personally. And I say that from some firsthand experience. What I'm using the C-Star for probably most frequently is with my undergraduate astronomy course that I teach at a local community college, Suffolk Community College. I'll set it up, and that school, Suffolk Community College, is just overwhelmed with lights. I mean, they have more lights on that campus than probably Times Square on New Year's Eve. They're just lit. It's just astonishing how many lights there are. And we used to have to go up on the roof of the science building, which is where my classroom is, set up a telescope on the roof to look through visually. And from the campus, we could barely see the Polaris. So we're talking second magnitude limit. So trying to see anything beyond something like the Pleiades or Orion Nebula or something bright, you're wasting your time, right? But now I come along with the C-Star, I plunk it down, not on the roof. I don't need to go up there. I plunk it down. There's a little, never called a quad, but every campus has a quad. It's kind of the same thing, that I go to an area which is a little bit darker. I set up the C-Star. I can have, I think it's up to 9, because I'm number 10. I think you'd have 10 phones or tablets or devices, okay, attached to it, and share the screen among those 10 people. So I'll set the thing up, I'll control it, and I'll point to wherever I want, and everybody looks at it on their phone. And so whether we share the view, I have a tablet here I use typically, and so forth. And so we're seeing things live that, okay, yes, I could show them pictures on the screen in the classroom and say, here's this, here's that. But the concept of seeing it live, I think, raises it to another level. So from an educational point of view, and they're beginners, these students, they don't know the moon from the sun in many cases. But to see it live makes it a little more real to them than just me talking about it in the room. So in that sense, I think it's wonderful.
And from an ease of use standpoint, I'm guessing it's easier for the beginners to, especially with the C stars, because the software is so intuitive.
Yeah, it is. Very simple. Very simple. Just turn it on. It finds this guy through plate solving, and I don't have to do anything. I turn it on and say, okay, kids, sit back. And it talks to you as it's going along. It moves very quietly, and all of a sudden we're in business.
No, I was going to say the Unistellar is a little bit odd in the sense that since some of the models do have that electronic eyepiece, it more closely resembles the traditional telescope. So when I do public outreach, for example, even though people can stream the image of their phones or tablets, I find people just enjoy looking through the eyepiece because it feels more like you're looking directly into a telescope, even though it's more of an illusion than not, because you're really just looking into a small electronic screen. But it's a nice feature.
Do you think that smart scopes enhance the accessibility or take away from the experience of observing?
Well, from me, I'll be honest. When I wrote my last book, came out in 2010, Cosmic Challenge, that was about 3 years worth of really grueling work. Okay. I would wake up at 3 o'clock every morning. Absolutely true. Took no mornings off. 3 o'clock in the morning. I spent 2 of the years outside with my 18-inch telescope or my 10-inch telescope or my 8-inch telescope or my 4-inch telescope, because I had to look at objects at different size, apertures. And I came up with a list of, a couple hundred challenging objects to see. And then I had to write the book. And that just drained the life out of me. It really did. To the point I thought, it actually dissuaded me from going out and looking at the sky with these telescopes. I was burned out. After I don't know how many decades, I was really burned out. And I took probably close to about 14 years off of doing any really serious observing. I go with the binoculars, I look around, and I got into solar observing with a hydrogen alpha scope, which I still enjoy immensely. But as far as the deep sky stuff, which was always that was my thing for 4 or 5 decades, I lost interest. And then all of a sudden I had to review this dwarf too. And then the Sea Star, and then the Celestron, and then the Dwarf 3. And I'm like a kid in the candy shop all over again. My wife says, "Oh, geez, here he goes. I thought he outgrew this." But here I am. So in that sense, it's rejuvenated me, and I'm this cranky old goat of an amateur astronomer from 1968, and all of a sudden doing these things, it's just astonishing. So I'm just having it's my rebirth, really. I credit all this stuff for it.
Are these scopes better for certain types of objects? Can you use them for planetary imaging?
I would generalize that deep objects are their forte. They have different, as you mentioned, different scopes have different fields of view. Some of the software allows more of a matrix field of view. So like in the case of the Vespera, I think originated the software having that sort of a matrix would expand the scale of what you could see. So instead of just kind of squeezing the Pleiades into half of the frame, you can now get 2 or 3 times the width of the frame with a longer exposure. So that was a change that's been echoed now by some of the other manufacturers. So I think Zwo now does that with their software. I know there's speculation that Celeron will do something similar at some point for their scope, and I'm looking forward if they can pull that off. So a wider field of view is, in many cases, very desirable to get the full nebula or whatever into the frame. If you're looking at galaxies, things that are smaller, obviously that's not an issue. In terms of the planets, they're really not appropriate. I mean, you can get planetary images, maybe some banding on Jupiter. You can get the phases of Venus, but anything that requires the level of magnification that planetary observation typically requires, it's really outside of their zone. The best I've gotten are maybe, some images of the Galilean moons with some banding on Jupiter, and that's about it.
Yeah, I haven't tried any planetary because I know I'm just going to be wasting my time, quite honestly. The moon works well if you want the full disk. Now, the Sea Star does have digital zooms, so I can digitally zoom in, but it pixelates, quite honestly. And I personally, I don't think the results are worth the level of effort. If you want to shoot the planets, you want to shoot the moon, there are no smart telescopes, to my knowledge at least, that are designed for that application. So therefore, you have to go back to the old regular telescope and your digital imager attached to it, and then you go from there. But for deep sky, they can't be beat.
I do have a spare probe that produces decent lunar images, but again, as saying, nothing at all like, for example, a Celestron 8, just a traditional scope would be able to resolve. So.
Don't the Sea Star and the Dwarf come with solar filters?
Yep, they do. I'm looking for it here, but I don't have it out with me now. The Sea Star actually comes with two because you have the two sides, the wide field and the so-called telephoto side. So it has a pair. Whereas you're right, the Sea Star has the one that caps on. The Sea Star actually produces some pretty decent images of it. The color is a little bit funky. So what I'll do is I'll typically save it as a black and white image, and then I'll add in my own color to it afterwards for whatever I want to make the sun look like that day. But even the straight black and white is nice. But their filter does a really good job of filtering nice contrasty image, but the color records kind of too orange for me. So I typically go black and white and then introduce my own color. But they work very well for that. At least the Sea Star does, especially.
So alignment and tracking can be tough with traditional rigs. How difficult is it for smart scopes?
Well, you don't polar align the Celestron. And so, yes, field rotation can be a problem. But what Celestron does, and the other ones do this also, at least most of them do, Dwarf does, Sea Star does, I believe, they have a small enough chip that any field rotation is probably beyond the chip. In other words, it doesn't record. Yeah, the corners do get a little bit fuzzy, depending on the altitude of the object, depending on other parameters. Like if it's right near the zenith, it's going to really rotate around. That's one thing. But if it's near the horizon, especially due east or due west, it's minimal, things like that. But so there are some tricks that you can crop the image also, of course, to get a field rotation artifact out of it as well. The latest generation of the Dwarf, though, does have an equatorial mode. So now you put it onto your tripod and you tilt it to your latitude, you aim it north, and of course there are apps on your phone you can use for helping to aim it and so forth. And then you turn this mode on, EQ mode it's called, and little images appear on the screen that will tell you how many degrees off you are and turn it, so many degrees counterclockwise or, so many degrees up or down, that sort of thing. And then it analyzes for maybe 30 seconds, say, oh, now I got to move it this way and that way. It takes some getting used to, okay? And I'm not used to it yet. But some people say they could do it in a matter of a couple of minutes. And I've hit it a couple of times pretty quickly, just dumb luck. And that's pretty good. The Sea Star doesn't have that, and Celestron doesn't have it. Actually, I think Sea Star does. I take that back. Yeah, the
Sea Star currently, and the Celestron they're intending to release it at some point, but we don't know when at this point.
No, we don't know.
ZWO is supposed to be coming out with a wedge and equatorial mode in the near future. I would think that Celestron could come up with a wedge for the origin pretty easily, which would really make it amazing. Also, Sam Wen from ZWO recently did an interview at a trade show in Japan with Quiv the Lazy Geek and revealed that the Sea Star S50 will be getting an upgraded sensor in new models. So if someone wants the best all-around smart telescope, what would you recommend?
Again, it kind of depends on what you have in mind, okay? Depends on the depth of your pocketbook, obviously. It depends on Are you going to use it in your backyard? Are you going to be flying around the world, taking a trip to Australia, and I want to bring my smart telescope with me? Things like that. And so it's really the same question. Someone will ask me, what's the best telescope? Depends on you. There are way too many variables. What's right for me could be completely wrong for somebody else, and vice versa. I think of the ones I own, the one I use the most is the Celestron. Okay, hands down. But that's because I'm taking it just out into my backyard. I set it up and then I walk it back in. Okay, so that's easy. If I was going to be traveling a distance by air, there's no way I'd take the Celestron. I would probably take the Dwarf, possibly the Sea Star. Okay, because you have to carry these things on. You can't check them. You have to carry them on. And so I'm not going to be carrying on that Celestron, but I could carry on the Sea Star, small enough, certainly, but the Dwarf would be very easy to carry on. I have it in a little camera, gadget bag that I walk around with. Inside is a tripod, is the scope, are the filters, everything I need in this little bag that weighs 3 pounds. So again, it depends on what you want to do with it and how much money you have to spend on it.
On balance, in terms of kind of bang for the buck, I think probably Sea Star offers the best all-around option for someone that's trying to jump into the hobby. I started, after the Unistellar, I've been really committed to the Vaonis line. And I have 2 of them. The original one, which I think is an extraordinary telescope, and I did get their Pro model, which has much better specifications, but there are kind of limitations based on the design of the telescope, so it doesn't really maximize what that chip is capable of. And it ends up resulting in much longer exposure times for similar results. And I'm actually a little bit disenchanted with that one.
Would you say that smart scopes are good for public outreach?
Well, I would. That's what I do with my classes. That falls under public outreach. You're showing people who don't know some of what you want to share with them. So in that sense, absolutely. But to touch a little bit about what you said a moment ago, how you're looking at it from the other side of the fence. I understand you're an accomplished astrophotographer using a traditional telescope and the digital imager and so forth. And I've had people come up to me and with a rather condescending tone, quite honest, saying, well, you're doing this, that takes no skills, blah, blah, blah. And I said, okay, so you're saying that I should be using a traditional telescope with a digital imager. Okay, I'm going to say that you shouldn't be doing that either, kid, because I grew up with 2475 recording film, okay, and or whatever it was called, and Tri-X and this and that. And then somebody's going to say to me, well, that's no good. I grew up with plate cameras. I say, that's no good. I grew up with daguerreotype. So you gotta, come on. Don't play this snob card with me. No way. If for that matter, if you want to go way back, I still be drawing on pave. So, give the program a little bit. This is where we are. It's a good thing because so many of us live under this impenetrable veil of light pollution. And that's why so many people aren't interested in astronomy anymore. How could they be interested in something they can't see? This is allowing them to see it. And so I think I see nothing but positive coming from it.
I absolutely agree. I think that's the most critical difference with smart scopes. I mean, I both live in very light polluted areas. And I never in my life thought I'd be able to see the kinds of things I'm able to image. When I tell people, when they look at the images I've made, that I took them in my backyard, they're like astonished. I said, well, I can't even see the stars around here. How is that possible? And that's a feeling of how incredulous I am sometimes about these scopes.
What's missing from today's smart scopes, and how can they improve on them?
To me, one of the biggest improvements, and I'm not sure how practical it is the battery life. Okay, that because with the Celestron, under the cold conditions that we've experienced recently, I like to shoot all-nighters. I'll set it up. I'll program in what I want to take, when I want to take it. I set it outside. I go to sleep. Okay, quite honestly, wake up the next morning, and I have half a dozen pictures. Well, recently, because of the cold, even the power bank I'm using hasn't been able to put up with the cold. And so the whole thing crashes halfway through the night. So if we somehow, and this is a problem with all rechargeable batteries, not just unique to these, but come up with something that would allow the battery to extend. I know with the Dwarf 2 to 3, they've improved the battery capacity tremendously also with the 3. So that's a good thing to see. That to me is the one thing. We have this capability of shooting all night long, and yet the batteries kind of flunk out, which can be a problem, especially in cold weather.
The problems are specific to the manufacturer. Like in the telescopes, the software is very well thought out, very easily used, and well integrated. But the file transfer mechanisms are very primitive, and I still have a clue why they haven't improved those over the years. And I guess one of the issues is going to be how many of these manufacturers are going to be able to sustain this, and how many of them are going to be in the playing field in the next couple of years. With heavy hitters like Celestron coming out and kind of blowing away some of the competition, I really fear for companies like Unistellar and probably Vaonis. I mean, briefly had on their website a $45,000 telescope called the Hyperia, which seems to have disappeared. And
I like the way that Celestron will be introducing replacement cameras, and the user should be able to replace them. So that's good. Okay, it's designed in to be able to do that. You can't do that with the C-Star or the Dwarf or maybe any of the other ones. For all, I'm not too sure about that statement, but with the Celestron you can. So that to me is a big plus. They're thinking ahead, and and a 6-inch aperture is a pretty good size. People said, "Oh, it's $4,000." Okay, let's add up numbers. How much do you spend on, let's say it's a 6-inch RASA type, astrograph. Okay, how much would that cost you, just the bare bones package? Then you throw in the mount. Okay, then you throw in the imager, the camera. And then you throw in some of the other bells and whistles. How much is that going to add up to? If you're not adding up the numbers, it's going to exceed $4,000. Mm-hmm. So the fact that you're getting it as a single integrated package like that, all ready to go, literally right out of the box, it's really a bargain. If you think about, if you were to put the package together yourself, what it would cost you. It'd probably cost you a lot more. At least that's my thought. So people complain about the prices. Think of what you're getting for $4,000, compared to what the individual pieces would cost. And I don't think you'd be complaining about the price anymore. And like I said, the C-Star and the Dwarf prices are, a tenth that. And it's amazing what you get for the buck. It really is.
I recently heard someone saying that the C-Star S50 is the equivalent of several $1,000s if you were to purchase everything separately and build a rig. Now, with the Celestron Origin being a compound system with a lens and a mirror, is collimation or aligning the optics an issue for end users?
So there is no way to collimate it, okay, number one. Okay, so if you do have collimation issues, then you're up a creek. But but no. Now, a funny story about the Origin. Well, not a funny story, it's sort of a sad story, but the Origin Facebook group, somebody came on and he said, I've ruined my telescope. He said he told a story that he was setting up the telescope for his neighbors. He was very excited, brand new, literally maybe the first or second night he had it out. So he's setting it up, he puts the mount out, the tripod, and then he carries the telescope out, and let me get it right, sets the tripod up, then the mount, and the telescope just slides onto a dovetail plate. Okay, fine. As he's tightening it, it wasn't engaged fully. He drops the telescope on the ground. The corrector plate shattered. Second night, shattered. And he showed a picture of it. Man, that was destroyed. Okay. He contacts Celestron. Celestron sends it back. I think they charged him something like $600 to replace the corrector plate. So that's pretty good customer support. Yeah. And they got it back to him in a matter of less than a month. So I came away very impressed with that. So, there are good points to the companies also. Dwarf is very responsive to people as well. And C-Star is, one of my students just bought us an S50. Based largely on, he saw me playing with mine, and he said, I want one of those. So he bought it. And the first one didn't work right for some reason. Just didn't, something was wrong with it. It kept disconnecting from the Wi-Fi signal, no matter how he tried. He tried in station mode. He tried direct connect with the telescope's Wi-Fi. It kept disconnecting itself. So I said to him, I said, well, he bought directly from ZWO. So I said, well, okay, why don't you reach out to them and see what they have to say. Long story short, they replaced it. And this is working fine. He showed me a picture of the Pleiades just last night that he took with, he's happy as a pig in mud. That day he's getting these pictures. So, and that's great to see. He bought it because of me, and that made me feel very happy that I've converted another disciple. And he's all set to go. So and I'm showing him pictures, and he's showing me pictures. The rest of the class is just saying, what are these two people talking about? And so it's good. It's all good.
It's to do with software releases. I think, and this goes across a number of manufacturers. I don't think they do nearly enough beta testing before offering new software, because oftentimes they're not fine-tuned. If a manufacturer has a number of different scopes, they're fine-tuned for the needs of a particular telescope. And so you end up with this catch-up cycle of patches and user discontent with this happening and that happening. And I think that's largely unnecessary if they simply would do more advanced beta testing before rushing something into the market. And I've been a victim of that a number of times now.
For someone thinking about getting a smart scope, what are some drawbacks that they should consider when making a purchase?
Well, I think if they need to understand their limitations. As Al was saying, you take a picture of planets. Okay, maybe you get a couple of bands on Jupiter, the phase of Venus and whatever. But if people are expecting, some of these really high def images of Jupiter or Saturn with one of these smart telescopes, they're going to be sorely disappointed. So they have to understand what the telescope is designed to do well. And and knowledge is everything. No matter what you buy, knowledge is everything. You have to know what you're getting. And I think the companies do a pretty good job of making that fairly well known, because they show all the pictures. You don't see any pictures of the planets. And if you go on any of the forums, everybody will say, "Oh yeah, forget the planets. They're not. They're really not. That's not their thing." So, I as long as people know what they're getting, they should be happy with it.
So one major drawback is there really isn't a smart scope that can do planetary imaging. That's primarily due to the shorter focal lengths and issues with plate solving a small field. Do you think that we'll see a planetary capable scope in the future?
Yes, that's what I've said. I think the idea of having a smart telescope for the planets, I think, is a matter of time. Quite honestly, for reasons like you cite. Okay, I think once we've taken that next step in this technology, like I say, I think it's only a matter of time that you'll see that.
I think planetary imaging through almost any telescope is largely a disappointment for people, because they're used to seeing images on the internet that were from space probes or from the largest telescopes, showing the level of detail and color that we don't compare seeing, even if you have an 18 or 20 inch telescope in your backyard somehow. So these smart scopes, I don't think will ever be positioned to be planetary scopes.
That brings us to our next topic, which is, do you think that smart scopes will eventually replace traditional astrophotography rigs?
Well, for me, I think the answer is they do already. All right. I really think they do. You take a look at some of the images that people are taking with any of them. Again, I keep going back to the Celestron, but it could be with the Dwarf, could be with the Sea Star, could be any of the other ones. And a lot of it is in the ability of the photographer, but that's true for all of it, right? That's true for all, no matter what. If you mentioned before that really steep learning curve with PixInsight and Photoshop and the rest of them, or Cyril and the rest of them, really steep learning curves for all of them. And the nice thing about these is, first off, they flatten the learning curve out because of their software, which is only getting better as time goes on. And I mean, I'm taking pictures with this. I keep going back to the Celestron, which I think. I mean, I get out of the way. I think my picture of the horsehead isn't bad when it's from my backyard. This wasn't taken from a Bortle 2 sky. This was taken from a Bortle 6 sky. Okay, that was about 20 minutes. But I just had the Dwarf out, the Dwarf 3 out, maybe 2 weeks ago, and I took a 5-hour exposure of M51. And was there a field rotation? A little bit, but that's okay because I was able to, because it's a relatively small object versus the size of the field, I could just crop that right down. And some of the detail in the outer regions of the spiral arms and some of the detail off the companion galaxy and so forth, really astonishing for, in this case, a 35 millimeter aperture with the Dwarf 3. 5-hour exposure. It was spot on. There was no drifting. There was no, football-shaped stars. They were spot on. So I don't know. I think, and again, I don't want to sound like I'm, looking down my nose for people like you who have all this skill. But you know what? I'm doing, I'll say 90% of it while I'm sleeping. And heaven knows I need my beauty sleep. So, it really works out very well. It really does.
Yeah,
their publication quality, because I've seen them run full page photos of my stuff in astronomy. That's okay. So you're getting high definition stuff, so publication quality stuff out of these things.
I would argue that traditional astrophotography rigs typically work at higher resolution and with much longer subframe exposures and total exposure times. They can produce images that show much finer details than a smart scope. But that's with today's technology. Likely smart scopes will improve with time. Al, what's your thoughts on this?
I was going to say, VAONIS runs group projects. So, for example, for an image like the horse head, they invite users submitted their best images that might only be an hour or 2 hour, 3 hour exposures, but then they take all of these exposures cumulatively, process them, and some of them, they've got several hundred hours of imaging into one object. And the result is mind-blowing.
Moving on, what advice would you give to someone who wants to purchase a smart telescope as their first scope?
Do it.
Yeah, like I say, do your homework first. Okay, know what you're buying. If you feel you want to take that leap, but again, I'd probably go with binoculars first. Okay, just so you get a feel for the sky. But if you are really dying to get into photography, astrophotography, I just do what Al said. Do it as long as you do your homework first, so you know which one is going to serve your purpose. Is it the Sea Star? I don't know numbers, but I'm just going to guess it's got to be the most popular one out there today. I don't know that. I haven't read any statistics. It's got to be, just based on the number of posts I see and comments. So is that the right one? What I said before, it depends on what you want to achieve with it. Depends on your circumstances. It certainly is affordable. $500 is a lot more affordable than $4,000, admittedly. But I could do things with the Celestron I can't do with the Sea Star, and vice versa. So if they, the best thing they could do is certainly seek out somebody who has one, like my student did with me. Then he said to himself, this is something I want to invest my money in and my time in. And he's very happy he made that decision. He said he's just started, but he's anxious, and that's what you look for. You look for somebody who's anxious. And if this sort of a device can ignite that in somebody who normally goes outside and can barely see Sirius and maybe not much else, because I know where he lives on Long Island, it's more light polluted than my backyard, even where he is. But if this is triggering him to pursue this, then I think we've won right on that level. And if he wants to pursue it and go in other more sophisticated directions later on, more power to him. Or if he just wants to stay here with the Sea Star, again, more power to him. I think it's great. It's getting him outside, getting him to look up at the sky. What's wrong with that?
Excellent points. Last month, I did an interview with two members of the WVAA, the West Virginia Astrophotography Association, which is a unique club in that it's focused on astrophotography. I've left a link to it in the show notes, but they have several dwarfs and sea stars that they lend to members. In fact, they offer life memberships to anyone who donates a smart telescope or equivalent to the club. I'm sure that some other more traditional astronomy clubs have loaner smart scopes that they use for outreach too.
Well, it's funny you mention that, because I mentioned I had the Dwarf 2, then I have the Dwarf 3 now. I'm donating my Dwarf 2 to my club, the Westport Astronomical Society. Here I'm on Long Island, but I'm one of the founding members of the Westport Club back in 1975. And I was talking to not the president, but one of the other guys on the board who I've known for decades. And I said to him, I said, would you guys be interested if I donate to the club my Dwarf 2? And he was, I could just see through the email, he was jumping out of his pants. So, oh yeah, I want to, so I see all your pictures. I want to play around with that. So yeah, so I'm going to meet him up at Northeast Astronomy Forum in April. And I'm going to say, here you go. And I'm going to give him the whole package. So I think that's great. And by the way, I already have life membership because I'm a founding member, so they don't have to give me anything. But I think it's great because I'm hoping they'll use it for public outreach because they do have open houses. I think it's still weekly, except if it's raining like it is right now, it's going to be closed. But I think it's great to go to schools and every other which and bring something like this along. And because, the kids nowadays, they're all about, my grandchildren are, they're all about either the PS5 or Nintendo or the iPad or whoever. Well, they can now use their devices, at least the iPads and whatever, and look at the sky. And maybe that's good because maybe that's a way to get away from things like Fortnite and Zelda and all that, and actually look at something that's maybe a little more real life. So I think it's great to use that technology that they love so much to educate them on something that we love so much.
So the Dwarf Labs and Sea Stars have built-in filters to help combat light pollution. What about the others?
The Dwarf 2 has them that you put on. The Dwarf 3 has them internal also.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, the original generation of the color products didn't allow for any filters, which is a liability. And on the Onus products, they have very good filters. They're very pricey for what they are, though. They're not included in the price of the scope. So if you want a dual band filter, I think they're asking $400 for dual band filter.
400, wow.
Yeah.
Huh. That's kind of pricey.
They actually build a computer chip into the ring around the filter so the telescope recognizes what it is and makes the appropriate adjustment. So if you try to put on a vanilla filter without those electronics, it doesn't work properly.
See, that's the nice thing about the Celestron and also the Dwarf 2 for that matter. You can put on any 1.25 inch, or with the Celestron also a 2-inch standard filter. So, I mean, I have the Celestron Nebula filter, which is a dual band, but I found that there are some drawbacks to that filter. If you take a picture of like the horse head behind me, and you have Zeta Orionis, really bright star in the same field, it's going to bloom because you're going to have a halo around it with that Celestron filter. But people have been trying other filters, and I used one which I actually have for the Dwarf originally, made by, how do you pronounce the company? SV Boney.
Oh, yes. I always say SV Boney. So.
Okay, SV Boney, or whatever it is. Anyway, but I have one of their dual band filters, and the blooming around the stars is significantly less. So all of a sudden now I'm using that one more than I am the Celestron. They're both dual band, and I'm not sure the exact wavelength passes, but I think they're pretty, judging by results. But you don't have that really strange halo effect around the bright stars. So that's great that you're able to swap this out. But you're saying with this one, you're really doomed to use their product.
Yeah, there are workarounds people that people implement, but they're not very effective.
And people have said again, going back to the Facebook group, the owners group, somebody within the last month apparently has just a box full of filters. And he was posting pictures of the exact same object. I can't think of what it was, but it was showing the different effects of this, I'll call it blooming effect, the disc. And yeah, that was one filter that they noted also. Nobody tested the Viboni one, but I found that worked pretty well also.
So in closing, what are your thoughts on smart telescopes?
Well, as I said before, it's rejuvenated my enthusiasm for it, my love for the hobby, certainly. But the nice thing is technology is always improving with these things, so we have to sort of keep an eye on that. Is there built-in obsolescence? Maybe, because you know that when you buy something, it's probably obsolete because somebody's coming up with the next generation. That happened with the Dwarf 2 and the Dwarf 3. I just wrote a review for the Dwarf 2. It finally appeared in the August issue of Astronomy. Meantime, they introduced the Dwarf 3 the month before. Like, okay. So, that you kind of expect because this is cutting edge technology and, it's always changing. Same thing buying a TV, a refrigerator, car. It's obsolete before you get off the showroom. And, but you have to understand that with these, but that's not to say that the Dwarf 2 isn't any good. It's still as good as the day I got it to test. So I would definitely say to stick with whatever you buy. Don't be like they have the iPhone 17. Oh, now I got to get rid of my iPhone 16. Don't be like that. Stick with it. Enjoy what you have. And it's like I say, it'll open up a whole new universe for you. Think that you never knew you could possibly see a photograph from your backyard is possible with most of these telescopes, indeed probably all of them.
I absolutely echo what Phil is saying. I mean, to me, these have opened up a whole new world of astronomy that, frankly, I never thought I'd have access to. Our yard is divided into all these funny little areas that have different lines of visibility. So if I'm going to use a telescope in my backyard or front yard, I've got to move it around different places. So I needed, rigs that were relatively portable. And these things you can pick up, place down, they're transportable. When you go to a darker sky place, you have more opportunities to see things you're not able to see in light polluted areas. I just couldn't be more excited than what is happening right now in astronomy.
Well, that's all for this episode. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope that you found our time together to be fun and helpful. If you have questions or episode suggestions, please email us at astroguypodcast@gmail.com or leave us a text or a voicemail at 973-404-0380. If you're not already a member, please join the Astro Guy Podcast group on Facebook. You can also visit our YouTube channel, the Astro Guy Podcast, for past episodes and other surprises. Please do all those podcast and YouTube things, such as like, subscribe, comment, and share. It really does help. Again, if you'd like to help support the Astro Guy Podcast and YouTube channel, you can do that by buying us a cup of coffee. The money is used to maintain and update the equipment that we use to create and publish the show. The link is in the show notes. Thank you again for joining us, and may your skies be clear. As always, Carpe Noctem, seize the night. I'm Wayne Zool, and this was the Astro Guy Podcast. Thank you for listening. As always, your questions, comments, and suggestions are welcome. Keep wondering. Keep your eyes on the sky. Have fun. Carpe Noctem. Seize the night.